Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a director here at Mina Partners. Thank you for joining us, whether you're listening to this program live or watching the recording. Appreciate you taking a little time out of your day for a conversation that we're about to have that we're calling Designing for Compliance, Operationalizing Age-Appropriate Design Codes, commonly known by the acronym AADC here in the United States. So we're going to get into this very hot topic these days in the world of privacy and IT security in just a moment. But before we do, I'm very pleased to be joined here by a couple of expert panelists. And so I'd like for them to introduce themselves now. And we can start with next, if we can go to the next slide, please. Uh, yeah, there we go. Luke, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself here at Mina Partners.
Hey, y'all. Very nice to take this opportunity to spend some time speaking about this today. My name's Luke Lebensky. I'm the principal engineer here at Mina Partners. Been with the firm working in the privacy space for a little over half a decade now, and spent a lot of my time working directly with clients. Here at Mina, we see a number of implementations. We work with everybody from the Fortune 10 all the way down to small, medium-sized business. So Dave and I have had the opportunity to really get in and see a number of ways of handling different, a number of ways organizations are handling these different regulations and requirements. So I think it'll be a fun conversation today to run everybody through some of the things that we're seeing, as well as some practical approaches to handling the AADC acts.
Terrific. Thanks, Luke, and thanks for taking some time out of what I know is a busy day for you here today. Also, very, very happy and thrilled to be having Harry Chambers join us from OneTrust. Harry, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your current role over there at OneTrust?
Hi, Dave. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Harry Chambers. I'm a regulatory content strategist here at OneTrust. Been with OneTrust for just under 5 years now. My role as a reg content strategist is really focused on looking at emerging laws and regulations in the US, the EU, but globally overall, and looking at how that impacts different OneTrust products. So anything to do with consent, DSAR, AI Gov, and of course, all of that has an impact, to do with children's data as well. So really excited to be here and talk about that more today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Harry. And if we can move to the next slide, we'll kind of show you what we intend to discuss today. We're going to start off in just a minute with giving you a kind of a lay of the land here in the United States with over the last couple of years with what's been developing. We're then going to kind of dissect that and talk about within these developments, what are some of the core legal themes that need, when we say operationalized systems that need to be put into place at companies that are interacting with the public and their customers, and how kind of where the pressure points are, the pain points there, and how to maybe overcome some of those. Then we're going to get into the weeds on that in terms of operationalizing some very specific issues that are brought up by this current wave of regulations and enforcement actions. And we'll get into some specific detail with that through the heart of the program. And we'll end with what we've seen as some common challenges, obstacles, and some mistakes that get made, and hopefully in an effort to have you be able to avoid them if you're seeking to put some of these systems into place at your workplace. And then we'll leave you with some kind of final takeaways, what we think are the most important things to focus on in this shifting landscape as we move forward. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And the last 2025 and 2026 have seen an incredible resurgence in concern about children's privacy online. Of course, those of you that have been in the privacy space for some time now know the landmark legislation COPPA that's been around for quite some time, has always sought to protect children online with regards to content and access, but things have really been taken to another level within the last couple of years. So U.S. states are rapidly proposing bills regarding legislating here, and importantly, California, who, as many of you know, often leads the way here in the United States in terms of state privacy law, has really broken some standards recently with, for instance, in the center column here, the partial AADC revival and the Ninth Circuit ruling that just happened earlier this year that allows some design-focused rules to, be put into place that are now new requirements for companies. And we're going to get into depth about that in just a minute. In terms of the legislative activity, it's amazing that 40 states, over 300 bills just in this year, all being proposed to, in one way or another, protect children online, both in terms of what they can access, how they can access things, and how they interact with apps and programs, both online and on in desktop and mobile versions. And so again, we're going to kind of get into that in depth. And there are some significant challenges being made by litigators, class action lawsuits, some of which have been successful recently, which are also probably going to be trend setting. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So before we move on, Harry, kind of what's your take on thinking about this kind of overall development over the past, say, year and a half, 2 years?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is that at least this year we have actually seen with comprehensive privacy bills, so that encompasses anything like the CCPA, there's actually been a fair amount of activity this year. But compared to last year, there was no comprehensive privacy bill that passed in any state, but the activity was all in children's data. And first of all, yeah, there were plenty of age-appropriate design codes and similar legislation focused on children's data or particular use cases. So anything to do with chatbots, AI companions, the more comprehensive age-appropriate design codes. And then you had legislation that even focused on the more technical side of it. So you had App Store Accountability Acts, passing in states like Texas or Louisiana, and there are similar instances that we've seen over the last year as well. And I think, the main area to think about this is that even in those US states where maybe there hasn't actually been a lot of history to do with privacy legislation, even in other states where there hasn't been, we've seen a lot of legislation to do with children's data. And I think it's inseparable from a greater societal focus on children's data as well. There have been a lot of publications out there about maybe children spending too much time online. And I think some of this legislation is a result of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And then Harry, also just staying with you for a minute here, and before we move on, since your remit over there at OneTrust is to kind of keep an eye on not just US legislation, but globally, UK and the EU, how would you kind of, in broad strokes, compare what we're seeing happening here in the US with some other global efforts?
Sure. I think a lot of the US legislation, particularly age-appropriate design codes, is actually modeled on a lot of the stuff that we saw in the EU. So the UK was one of the first jurisdictions to pass an age-appropriate design code. And now in the US, you have a lot of legislation which uses the exact same terminology. I think there was one state where it was an age-appropriate design act. They didn't use the word code in there, but by and large, the requirements, and we'll talk about what are the obligations expected from organizations that are in scope. A lot of the requirements were very similar, and we've seen similar developments in a lot of other EU jurisdictions, either as explicit legislation or as guidelines published by data protection regulators or media regulators overall. And even outside of the EU, we've seen increasing activity from jurisdictions like South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, focused on children's data. So this is definitely a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and so perhaps a bit of good news here. Would it be fair to say that if these obligations are somewhat similar or even very similar, that's going to make the task of operationalizing them to some extent? There will be some commonalities, and it might be a little bit easier than vastly varying requirements globally for those companies that are operating globally?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible to think of, any of the US legislation and EU or UK legislation as part of a global framework for children's data. I mean, we'll speak about this more as well, but, you've got to think about it in terms of trends and, in terms of trends and wider design, less so than complying with individual pieces of legislation from different jurisdictions.
Yeah, makes good sense. All right, well, with that, let's go ahead and move on. And we wanted to kind of sketch out for you what we think are some kind of what we're calling core legal themes that are going to need to be operationalized. For those of you that are practicing privacy professionals that have been in the space for a while, these shouldn't be too surprising. We're going back to some core principles that have been around for decades, but are still very important with regards to complying with AADC requirements. So starting with privacy and safety by design, this is something that privacy professionals have been talking about and trying to push for within their companies for a long time now. And that is at wherever you are in your company, if you can develop relationships with early development, early stage development, R&D for new products, new services, and get the awareness of the collection, storage, processing of personal and sensitive information, in particular, in this case, children's information, as early on in the process as possible, you'll save yourself many headaches down the line, as opposed to kind of rushing and scrambling to try to understand whether you're going to be collecting too much information or collecting it inappropriately as you're just about to launch a product or service. So let's just pause on this one for a minute, and let me turn to you, Luke. I know this is something we talk about with our clients all the time, and those that have taken the steps to try to look at these issues early on in the development cycle have saved themselves a lot of headaches down the line, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and what we're seeing a lot of times is that, as you mentioned to start with, these are basic principles that really have been focused on as part of creating a more mature and robust privacy program throughout the past couple of years, even before any of these AADC things came online in the full extent that we're seeing today. Additionally, as part of that, you might find that going through and performing some of your basic privacy by design fundamentals during the initial phases or early stages of architecture and development basically save you having to reorganize and restructure databases or entire data lakes down the line, which is going to save you a whole lot of time and effort and energy in terms of actually structuring what those tables look like, what any of those relationships within the databases are built to be, and then additionally making sure that you have appropriate and secure control over the segregation and segmentation of child data versus adult data. Things that, again, frankly, probably are in place to some extent within your organization already, is really just making sure that you now have effective documentation around them to say, hey, we are already doing this. This is something that we have been in the practice of doing. Or if you are going to take that step now, really making sure that you have the controls and the workflows in place to say, from here on, from this point forward, this is something we are going to make sure that we take attention to. For that, in the worst case scenario, you do get a regulator knocking on your door, you have documentation that is time-stamped, has been signed off by executives. The last thing that we want to have happen to any of our clients or any of the organizations that we're working for is to have to go through the process of saying, hey, we can prove this, we can do it, but if a regulator does come knocking, that always helps in having that conversation to say, we've done this before. This is something that we are actively responsible for handling, and it's something that we have, proof and control of, evidence to go against whatever claims that a regulator or any external party is making.
Yeah, absolutely, Luke. And this next one, data minimization and purpose limitation, is a really big one, and this is actually gaining a lot of attention. It's been around; these principles have been around forever, but they're getting more attention now. There's actually a lot of talk about data retention, which can seem like a kind of a boring housekeeping type task, but is actually extremely important in terms of risk minimization. And it's getting more attention recently, which has been kind of interesting. Data minimization is, for those that are not familiar with the term, is simply understanding that you should be collecting only the personal and sensitive information that you strictly need, that you really need in order to interact with the customer and provide the services that they're requesting or the products that they're requesting. So keeping that minimized, and then also collecting it for certain reasons. Letting the user or the customer know what reasons you're collecting it for, documenting their consent for those uses, and then staying within those uses will go a huge way to reducing your organizational risk. Those basic principles. Now, that's kind of easy to say in theory, but honestly, practices, I would say, have a gravity toward the opposite. Engineers, when they're designing things, it's not at all uncommon to be like, well, let's collect this piece of data, this data element, because we might need it at some point. We don't know how we're going to use it now, but let's just get it now while we can and store it somewhere so that we, can leverage it later if we need to or want to. That's a very common tendency. So that's the opposite of data minimization. And purpose limitation as well. Collecting a bunch of data, and then you've got another team analyzing this customer database, internal customer database, and you think, oh, we could do this new analysis, or we could offer this new product, roll out this new marketing campaign. not understanding that that data was collected under different circumstances and maybe without consent to use it for those purposes can really be a problem down the road. So, Harry, do you have any kind of thoughts about those principles and those thoughts?
Yeah, I think first, I mean, principles are great, and a big focus from regulators that we've seen in enforcement actions and guidance is making sure that any of the principles you state, say in your privacy policy, saying that you comply with principles like data minimization and purpose limitation, regardless of how you state it in your privacy policy, unless you actually operationalize it, it counts for nothing. And we've seen this specifically in the context of data minimization and purpose limitation. So from enforcement actions from regulators like the CPPA in California, we've seen specific call-outs that certain data should be deleted after a certain period of time. I think the idea of, as you said, like collecting data because it may be useful somewhere down the line. I think it's particularly tempting for organizations in the age of AI as well, that, hey, we could use this data for, training an internal AI model as well. That's something that would have to be specifically disclosed to a user. And of course, when it comes to minor or child users as well, there are additional risks as to what that data can be used for as well. In terms of sort of purpose limitation as well. I think, and this links closely to age assurance and child segmentation, which we can speak on. I think the intention there is very, very important. So, particularly when you're collecting data for, say, age assurance purposes, making sure you're limiting that to, what is necessary for that age assurance, say deleting it, immediately afterwards as well. And the guidance that we've got from different regulators, even at the federal level, like the FTC, has been particularly clarifying here. They've been saying exactly, okay, listen, we're not going to bring an enforcement action against an organization that is simply collecting more personal data in order to effectuate some kind of age assurance or age verification practice if it's, say, deleted right afterwards and it isn't going to be used for another purpose that it wasn't immediately disclosed for.
That's a perfect segue into number 3 here, which we'll get to in just a minute. But before we do, Harry, you bring up an extremely important point, and that is with regards to privacy notices, your outward-facing promises that you're making to your customers with regards to how you're collecting and processing their information. Current enforcement actions, I would say it's very safe to say a current trend is regulators are looking to see that these privacy notices match with actual operations. So if you say that you are going to be only using the information for certain purposes and that users have the ability to opt out at any time, you better have those mechanisms in place to actually effectuate those promises that are made. So it's that alignment between your publicly stated promises and the operations that allow those to happen. They better be in sync, and that's where we're seeing a lot of enforcement actions these days. So word to the wise, not only on the children's information, but in personal information management in general. On this next one, age assurance and child segmentation, I think we're going to take a little deeper dive later on in the program on this. But Luke, curious to hear your thoughts about the challenges operationally with different approaches to trying to understand the age of users as they visit websites.
I think the biggest thing, particularly if you're a service that's been operating historically with the understanding that, hey, we are providing a platform or a service, a system, a mobile app, a website that should be accessible by all ages, is now shoehorning in age assurance and ID verification to some extent into your already built workflows and platforms. You're basically re-architecting and restructuring a lot of the workflows and user experiences that you may have spent years, a decade, really honing in and making sure that it was a flow that is optimized for what the end goal is. And now all of a sudden you have to disrupt that. And that is going to really, and what we've seen is that sets a big impact on users' experiences and their perspectives of the platform and how they're using it as well. So it's going to be a disruptive event that has to take place. I think, Harry, Dave, what you're covering on in terms of how the regulators are treating additional collection of personal data is really important, from things like the actual lawsuits or regulatory actions that can come from the government and the agencies there. But it's also important to understand from the business side the reputational risk that you're running now of having to do this stuff and put it in place. Users, by and large, don't like this. It's not something that the end user is jumping for joy, like, oh, great, I need to put my ID in to order a sandwich on my quick service restaurant app, right? This is something that overall has not been met with a lot of fanfare. So I think it's important to understand that while this may be something that you need to have a very quick put in place operation to meet, you really need to be thinking about long-term, hey, this is something that we're probably not going to be able to get away from. So how do we minimize the impact that this has on the end user philosophy of our platform, the reputational perspective that a user has about our organization out in the marketplace? And frankly, no news is good news in this event. If you're not seeing rumblings online of, hey, something went on, something happened, a lot of the times that is the situation that a lot of our clients want to be in is, hey, we get to roll this out. It feels relatively seamless. We're not getting too much of an impact to the actual user experience and the whole journey, but we're still meeting the requirements that we need to.
Yeah. And Luke, you actually provided, again, a really nice segue to number 4 here, this last one, which, as I was just thinking about this, restrictions on profiling and automated decisions. If you are using automated decision-making, i.e. AI tools, in order to do some business intelligence and or sophisticated marketing campaigns, and you're running those algorithms or those systems utilizing data from miners, you're basically compounding risk, right? So if you want to talk about high risk situations that should be looked at and thought about very carefully before they're rolled out to the public, this is absolutely someplace you want to do this. Now, look, is there a business pressure to be able to do this? Are there business opportunities here? Of course there are. But there is a lot of risk inherent in this as well. Again, you're compounding regulatory risk by looking at automated decision-making with miners' data. So hopefully that's pretty self-evident. And in the interest of time, I think let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, if we can. We've talked about this earlier, privacy by design and data minimization, kind of getting into the weeds here a little bit, just to kind of quickly cover over some basic principles if you're looking at putting this into place or enhancing this at your organization. So risk assessments early on in the product design, we talked about this. Most privacy professionals are familiar with the terms PIA or DPIA, privacy impact assessments. Having these in place, well thought out, ready to launch for any new product or service, you're going to want to have those ready, and especially ready for new products or services involving children's data. So make sure that is in place in your privacy program. Privacy default settings are just taking the conservative approach. If you are dealing with people online that you think fall into the category of minors, set your default controls in the most conservative ways that you can to minimize risk. And as we spoke about before, data minimization practices limit what you're collecting and what you're storing and processing just all throughout the data life cycle in order to minimize risk. And then this last one probably does bear speaking about for just a minute: cross-functional collaboration. You know, over here at Mina Partners, when we work, when we put together a custom project team to work with our clients, almost always we have a primary point of contact, but then we have secondary and tertiary points of contact within these important departments, always legal, engineering, marketing, product development teams. And it's really important to get that privacy awareness education out there within the different business units. Luke, maybe over to you to just talk about the importance of this cross-functional collaboration within this idea of data stewardship within organizations.
This is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we run into on a daily basis. You have fundamental business needs that need to be met, whether that is click-through revenue or sales targets, or even just specific metrics that you want to try and achieve in terms of page views and things like that. So really having to kind of translate these business requirements back into legal standards, and then vice versa, those legal standards and requirements back into business requirements as part of creating an engineered platform is something that you are going to consistently run into. And so having what we've seen be called champions or kind of stewards of privacy within your organization in each one of these factions really helps to make a more condensed and concise approach towards meeting the end goal, which is all what everybody wants, right? You're working towards the same goal as an organization. You may have different requirements as part of your job function, whether you're in privacy or legal or engineering or marketing, but at the end of the day, you're working for the same organization, and you need to just have a standard baseline goal to reach at the end of whatever project or engagement you're working on. And so as part of having this cross-functional collaboration, really having a champion or steward to say, hey, this is something that I'm going to assist with owning and making sure that we get our voices heard from the engineering team, or our concerns from the marketing team, or our concerns from legal across to the other organization or the other portions of the organization, is something that's critical, and making sure that everybody understands we're all working towards one goal. We all have the same hope to get there, but we have different ways of approaching it.
Absolutely. And one more thing that I wanted to touch on quickly before we move off from this slide, the bottom of the privacy default settings there, we're particularly calling out geolocation and data sharing. And Harry, safe to say, these are some elements that we're seeing kind of across the line in the different legislations that are emerging.
Yeah, I think thinking about areas like precise geolocation is one of the main reasons as to why, when you're thinking about, operationalizing children's data protections, it's much better to think of it in terms of wider privacy trends rather than necessarily something specifically to do with children's data as well. Talking about the last slide about age segmentation, one of the main difficulties that we found is simply that every single US state potentially has a different definition as to what constitutes a minor. And within that as well, there are different prohibitions on, say, the sale of precise geolocation for children's data, potentially, or just the sale of precise geolocation data overall. This is something that we've seen when it comes from regulators, and it's something that they've considered in enforcement action too. They consider precise geolocation a very sensitive type of data as well, because of what you can gain from having somebody's precise geolocation data as well. So in terms of the risk assessment that you do at the very beginning, before the design of a product or a new feature, looking at particularly types of sensitive data like precise geolocation data should be one of the main focuses.
Terrific, thanks. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So age assurance, profiling limits, and decision-making controls. This is where we can kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these challenges with operationalizing these obligations. Risk-based age assurance. Here there really are some lower risk ways to try to verify age, and some higher risk ways to do that. Luke, just as we were kind of warming up for the program here before we went live, we were talking a little about the kind of two main approaches here in general. Do you want to talk to us about those and kind of their pros and cons?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things as well to touch on before I get into some of the present day technical aspects as well is that, as a whole, protecting children has been a strive in new media since the 1990s or the 1980s, right? The Children's Television Act that came around, initially introduced in like 1988, and then in the early 90s was finally solidified to say, hey, we have to do something. We're kind of in the Wild West of marketing and usage on television for children, and now we're seeing basically the same resurgence in modern day. And so when it comes to actually performing some of these things, as Dave mentioned, there's a couple different pathways you can take. The first one is going to be the most intrusive. It's perhaps the lowest risk in terms of actually verifying age. That's using these platforms like ID.me, right, which is used by the government in terms of getting IRS tax data. So you want to talk about really setting your sights high and providing the deepest level of ID verification and age verification that you can. It's using these external providers, which are kind of vetted by the US government in some manner or shape or form. Additionally, there's also some lighter weight approaches that you can take, which is basically just asking the user how old they are, right? And taking the approach that, why would the user lie to me, right? If we're going to take the basis of how can we make sure that we're doing our part Well, we're asking them to be truthful and upfront with the information that they're providing to us, whether that's their email address, their address, their social security number, whatever you're intaking. Age is just another piece of data to do that. And as Harry and Dave mentioned earlier, regulators typically aren't going to knock down your door to say, hey, why are you collecting additional data? It's like, well, we're doing it for the sake of meeting regulations that have come about. And so when it comes to actually managing what those risks look like versus the lower risk, which is, hey, you're really making sure that things are acting as they should. You're going through a handful of different steps, whether that's asking for a driver's license or going through these third-party verification platforms, which as a user perspective, again, interrupts the experience way more. You might have to do things like biometrics for ID verification, selfie scanning, things of that sort, which really put a damper on, talking earlier, reputation, public perspective of your organization, your brand. Why do I need to provide a driver's license to order a sandwich on a mobile app? It doesn't make a ton of sense. Versus just saying, what a lot of online game store and platforms do, which is, hey, I'm just going to ask you for your age. You tell me your age, and then you can view this content, this M-rated game, or go through the platform and see whatever appropriate cached version of a website where you're meant to see based on whatever that looks like. But again, talking about risk, if you're actually doing things like true remarketing and retargeting, you probably have a decent understanding of who a user is via the things that they are doing on the internet for your marketing campaigns, whether that is they're looking at, specifically a lot of children's focused media and content, and you understand that, and they come to your site and you already have that profile. It's like, why are you then asking them to verify their age? You have a decent understanding of it. And we saw that come through in the Disney action as well, which was Disney had a solid understanding of who a user was. And so they would then make you re-verify and ask who that user was again in order to perform data rights, like opting out or data deletion or things of that sort. So I think we're going to see a number of those instances come about as well, which is, hey, you're doing advanced marketing to a level where you can understand an age bracket that a user might be in. You might not know exactly who they are. You might not know the exact age that they are, but you have a generalized bracket to a high level of confidence. Why can't you apply that to also segmenting your audience and performing those minimization or control techniques to that user based on the information that you already have, instead of asking for them to provide additional information on top of it? So again, I think that's going to depend a lot on how the different administrations in state by state legislation is going to treat each one of these, and then ultimately come down to how each one of them are litigated and pushed back on by the organizations as well.
Yeah, and Luke, it just really brings up a very interesting conundrum, and that is, if you're going to decide that you're going to want to collect more personal information in order to identify the user's age, and then you're for some reason storing that information, Harry, over to you. Now you're actually collecting more personal information in order to understand the precise age of the user, and now you've got this personal information within your systems. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of trying to minimize that data and making decisions to minimize that data, and also keeping it separate from other personal information as a risk minimization strategy?
Sure. I mean, this is a priority for regulators, and I like Luke's call out for like other regulator action that we've seen here. And I think it's the idea of, where an organization has, say, a known user, they have, say, a profile on a particular website. They shouldn't necessarily be collecting more information about that user, where any kind of sort of data subject request or any kind of information that you need from the user, you probably already have as well. But as we've said as well, in terms of sort of how you actually use the information of users to, say, verify their age as well, this is something that, regulators understand as well, because I think maybe a year ago, this was a big question by a lot of organizations. They were like, well, that's great that, we implement age assurance practices, but, a lot of them, especially a lot of laws, have this idea of using reasonable care for particularly sort of high risk activities when it comes to children's data. Regulators have come forward and, they have been clear. They are, making sure that organizations, if they are collecting the data, that, the organization doesn't use or disclose any of the information collected for age verification, for any other purpose except for determining a user's age. That's totally fine from a regulator's perspective. Likewise, the retention period as well. So just not retaining any of that information for longer than necessary, deleting it, very soon after is also something that they want. In terms of disclosing information to third parties, this is something again that we've seen a lot prioritized by different regulators as well. The types of information that you give to third parties as well, as long as organizations have taken some kind of steps to determine the third parties, particularly when organizations are relying on third parties for age verification, as long as you're taking verifiable steps to determine, say, the confidentiality, the security, and the integrity of information you're disclosing to third parties, then at the end of the day, from a regulator, you're also, at least from a regulatory perspective there, you should be in the clear as well. And I think a load of this links to maybe this final point of transparency and user understanding as well. Again, it's great to have it say all fine on the operational side as well, but it's making sure that users understand why you maybe need this information as well from a trust perspective as well. A lot of the age-appropriate design codes that we've seen are very specific in that they want organizations to use language appropriate to minor users as well. So this may mean that the content you have in a privacy policy, if you know that, say, a lot of your users are going to be child or minor users, the language within that has to cater specifically towards those users as well. So that does introduce another element of compliance there, but that is a clear expectation from regulators.
Yeah, and just to finish off on these last 2 points here, as you mentioned, Harry, if you're going to, engage in the already mentioned relatively risky, processing of automated decision making or using AI tools for business intelligence with minors' data. At the very least, hopefully you've done a very careful analysis of the inherent risks in that. And if you are deciding to proceed, at the very least, it's critical to make that known. And you mentioned this earlier, Harry, through your notices that you're super transparent. And as you just pointed out, in language it's understandable to the age group that you're targeting your services to. So terrific. Well, let's keep moving on to the next slide, please. And this is interesting. This will be good to talk a little bit about this: design restrictions and accountability mechanisms. There are, let's see, maybe let's group these first two here. Design restrictions for user safety, healthy engagement. I've been waiting to get around to this, which is a key point in this entire discussion, and that is as you're looking at providing services and products to minors, one of the things that the recent case out in California, judgment in favor of the plaintiff in terms of mental health harm through social media platforms that engaged in processes that were designed through behavioral health or psychology experts to keep engagement solid with users. Ideas like regular push notifications and scrolling, increased scrolling. These kinds of platform design features have been deemed to have caused harm and are now under regulatory scrutiny. So if you are engaging any of these design techniques within your product and service lines, you have to be very, very careful with whether they are going to be deemed healthy or unhealthy. So I'm not sure which of you guys might want to comment on that and these developments, which are relatively new.
Yeah, I think, again, this is really interesting. And this is kind of the segue why I brought up the Children's Television Act earlier, which specifically guide rails around the amount of hours that a network or segmented block of channels could air children-focused advertising. It was like 156 hours per quarter or something like that, right? And so it's these foundational guidelines that say, hey, listen, you are doing things with the explicit intention of streamlining an experience for users so they spend more time with your business, interacting with your business, doing whatever. Or in the case of the Children's Television Act, it was You want children to engage more with commercials, spend more time on your channel. You want them to not tune away whenever a commercial break comes up from their show, because you want it to be aimed towards children. And then hopefully that returns back some purchasing power towards your organization. And so, again, you talk about the spirit of the law, or the spirit of what this legislation is here to do. And it's really to try and stop some of the admittedly predatory behavior that has come about in recent years for things like doing user psychology analysis to say, what's the easiest way that users can navigate around a post or a series of posts? What are they saying more engaged with, right? It could be things like increasing the brightness when you go to certain video platforms versus using the image side of platforms. Looking at some of the modern day social medias, which will purposefully up colors, up contrast, up saturation in order to get people more engaged, right? To give them brighter colors, a better experience, have them stay on those platforms for longer. These are all things that, well done with the intention of saying, hey, we're increasing revenue, we're getting people to come to our site and interact with our experiences more. They're doing it with a little bit of an underhanded approach to basically say, we're not just increasing the way that users are experiencing this, we're trying to cue them to certain psychological benefits, whether that is brighter colors, quicker transitions, or more seamless views between content so they don't get interrupted and they're more willing to spend more time with us. Or as Dave mentioned, those push notifications have been a big one, right? So getting people to remember and re-interact, associating sound cues, almost like a Pavlov dog training, right? So you're kind of getting people to reinstitute whatever they feel like is a positive experience with your application, and then associate it with the sound. So they pull it out of their pocket and log back into your app as quickly as they possibly can. These are all things that were really cool in theory to some extent from a scientific perspective, but have serious implications on a user's health. And as such, repercussions now that organizations or plaintiffs are realizing that organizations are doing this with a distinct intention.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, I think, that we were talking about again a little bit before the program started here, for many years, just social media platforms, but other companies as well that engage in these techniques have been able to use almost as a shield what's known as Section 230, which protects platforms from the content that's posted on their platforms. They're basically saying, hey, well, we're just providing a stage, and it's the people can put whatever they want on the stage, First Amendment rights kind of thing. And that Section 230 law has allowed them to kind of avoid some liability with regards to these things. But these new challenges against the design features of the platform itself that are put in place in order to maximize user engagement is really a new development, and really kind of changes the playing field a little bit. Harry, do you have any kind of comments on that? And that, we were talking a little bit about that tension between the these designs in platforms versus, some of the legal challenges that are coming back against that are, First Amendment rights of free speech and being able to post content. So it's an interesting kind of conversation that's happening in the courts regarding this right now.
Yeah, I'd say I think it's interesting that the fact that regulators are looking at this is very reflective in the legislation which follows as well in different age-appropriate design codes, focusing less so on the content, probably because it is more difficult to regulate content itself, but looking at the design features that prompt you to look at the different content has been a big focus. And I think, something that was great was mentioned earlier is the spirit of the law, from conversations that have been had with different regulators. The big thing of a lot of the laws is even when something isn't explicit, because, from a technical and operational side, nothing is ever very clear as to how exactly you should do something. But, all the different age-appropriate design code, the idea of exercising some kind of reasonable care in the use of a minor's personal data and the design and the operation of that particular service has been central. So this may be in just disabling certain design features that prompt users to use a particular service or interact with a form of content, even limiting the amount of time that a user can spend on an online service, or restricting the ability to view a user's location information, again going back to particular types of sensitive data as well. And I think talking about design as well, there are lots of ways to design content, so it isn't maybe considered a dark pattern under different forms of legislation, that it's prompting users to interact. But it's also design is also very important in an active sense as well, designing or adding new features essentially that remind users, say that, hey, you're interacting with this piece of content. And I think this is very clear in the different kinds of legislation that we see to do with children and AI chatbots or AI companions as well. So different legislation that we've seen in, say, Oregon and Washington State just over the past 2 months essentially requires some kind of notice to be given to users and minor users, not just when they first interact with it, but every few hours after they're interacting with a service. So again, it's not just preventing a user from using a service, but when they are using a service, reminding them, hey, by the way, this is an AI chatbot that you're providing information to as well. So this kind of active design that reminds users themselves of the potential risk that they have or the information and disclosures about the type of service they're interacting with is also very important, alongside of preventing them from, say, interacting with a service entirely.
Yeah, and just for those users that aren't familiar with the term dark patterns refer to usually graphic or aesthetic design choices that nudge a user to one particular choice over another, as opposed to having equal choices. So for instance, two buttons with opt-in, opt-out that are the same color, same font, that just provide equal opportunity for the user to do whichever one they want, as opposed to a big green button that says opt-in and some tiny little font down below that says opt-out that's difficult to see, would be a practical example of a dark pattern. And to your point, Harry, you could almost think about a reverse dark pattern, in that you're going above and beyond by reminding the user that very clearly and very consciously that they're making a choice to do something, and therefore making it quite obvious that they're providing consent on a regular basis, throughout the user journey. Would be an example of maybe an opposite dark pattern, as it were. In this effort of time and wanting to kind of get through as much material as we can in the rest of the slideshow here, these two middle columns, accountability through documentation and governance and joint responsibility, really refer to a lot of what we do, again, at MIDA Partners with our clients on a daily basis, which is just make sure you're documenting your internal policies, how you intend to do things, who's responsible, documenting. We produce documents called RACI charts, which are just literally an accounting of who is responsible for what process, who needs to be informed in what process, and who has authority to make changes, etc. And just having that all in one place, it's really easy to see that who's accountable is a relatively straightforward thing, but also very important. And then this last column, third-party risk management. This is something, again, we do at MIDA Partners all day, every day, helping our clients work with their myriad of third-party vendors, and just making sure that the data processing activities that are in place when data is being outsourced are clear, regarding what data is flowing, how it's being used, under what circumstances, and making sure that DPAs, data protection agreements, are kept accurate and up to date, which is a huge challenge because most of our clients are very large and have many, many vendors. So it's an ongoing challenge, but a very important thing to focus on. So with that, let's go ahead and move to our next slide, please. And now we're heading toward the tail end of our program here, and we wanted to share with you what we've seen as some challenges, obstacles, and some common mistakes that we've kind of seen. Regulatory fragmentation is what's causing a lot of the companies that we work with to spend a lot of kind of time and energy sifting through and sorting what regulations are in scope for me, and that I need to comply with, and how do they vary from state to state to state. As we mentioned at the top of the program, Harry, a little bit of good news in that, at least regarding age-appropriate design code, there's a fair amount of commonality or similarity across jurisdictions, so that there can be some common practices and operations put into place that should cover multiple regulatory obligations. So there's some good news there. But it's very important to keep an eye on regulations because they change frequently. New ones are coming into play, and there is some variation. We've talked about technical complexity. One of the things that is kind of a daily occurrence for us is as user interactions take place over multiple sessions online on multiple devices, possibly even across multiple brand names within a corporate entity, it becomes challenging to, for instance, have consistent application of policies and procedures across multiple channels, multiple devices. And let's see. Yeah, so we, I think probably our recommendation here, and then I'd love to turn to both of you for your comments on this, in terms of kind of effective strategies with regards to compliance. Maybe if you want to take if you want to try to minimize risk, take a more conservative approach, try to apply it generally, and then look for specific applications that may call out, within an individual law for something very specific in terms of changes in language that require something specific for that state. Maybe setting up a high baseline, and then look for variations on top of that as kind of a compliance strategy we see our clients take regularly. So maybe Luke, over to you to hear a little bit about your personal experience with these design considerations with our clients, and then Harry, left to hear about kind of compliance strategies from you as well.
I'll keep it brief from the technical side. I think the biggest shift that we've seen is not just providing kind of different experiences on the same platform for minors or children versus adults. It's completely providing a wholesale different experience altogether, a different platform altogether, whether that's launching a brand new application in a marketplace or using a different domain altogether in order to serve those minor focused experiences. One, keeps the experience a lot cleaner, right? You're not having to introduce all of these additional hoops for individuals who arguably you're probably targeting much, much less than the direct-to-consumer traditional model, which has been focused on kind of paying consumers, right? You want to target people who have money, all things considered. And so providing these different experiences for minors, which are meant to interact with your brand, whether it's small little games that they should play for your quick service restaurant, or, hey, it's navigational guides for your parks, whatever that may be. Having these different experiences, which are gated wholly separately from the actual adult-focused experience or the paying customer experience, is a big approach that we're seeing. You're not having to overcomplicate design. You're not having to overcomplicate user experience altogether. And you can really make sure that you're complying with these actions without having to upend all of your current business practices today.
That makes sense. And then, Harry, as you kind of look at, coming from the perspective of the OneTrust consent management platform, what are some kind of thoughts or strategies with regards to complying with multiple jurisdictions and multiple different laws for customers?
Sure. So I think, as we've said already, like with regulatory fragmentation, it can appear difficult to comply with all these different regulations across different jurisdictions, where, say, the definition of a minor is slightly different, and the requirements and obligations that you're subject to as a result will change. But I think three main points I would have is, firstly, take a perspective for each of the laws, not just focusing on the individual details, but focus on the spirit of the law again, because this is the perspective of regulators that we know about as well. Obviously, there are, say, specific requirements and specific disclosures that have to be made, and you need to be aware of that, but focusing on the spirit of individual laws and regulations, so exercising some kind of reasonable care. And a lot of these requirements are very similar to sort of the privacy by design requirements we see under more comprehensive privacy laws as well. I think another important area is to make sure that you're documenting a lot of this information as well. We know from regulators that, audits and looking at your internal privacy practices and documents is going to be a priority from them. At least we know from the CPPA that they've just hired a privacy auditor and that they're going to be auditing companies' internal privacy practices. And we know as well that the CPA has made children's data an enforcement priority for this year as well. And I think overall as well, looking at your privacy practices, because there are so many laws and regulations that are coming into effect all the time, it's important to make sure that there is no set and forget. If you are an organization, you finally figure out essentially the operations of the collection of children's data and making sure that you have age assurance mechanisms in place. Don't just let that settle for, say, a year. Make sure that every quarter you're coming back, working with different stakeholders within the organization to check that the data that you say you're collecting in any kind of public-facing document, like a privacy policy, is actually reflective of what you're doing in practice as well. So regular review of any of your privacy operations is central.
Yeah, and again, just these are well-known good governance practices, but they do take effort. And for a lot of our clients, we'll do a privacy assessment, and we'll find that maybe some great operations are in place, but there's no documentation kind of supporting that, or vice versa. There's some great policy documents, but the operations need development or need tweaking or improving, and so that just creates a gap map and a roadmap for how to tighten things up. And then, as you point out, Harry, it's not a set and forget. It's a regular dynamic process. So you just set a cadence and just revisit that. And once the big initial capital lift is done, it's iterating and tweaking and improving it, and the lift is lighter as you roll down the line. So really good standard basic advice, but still very important in this application. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So we're wrapping up here. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, we're about to move to a question and answer period, and feel free to send those to us. If you have any, we'll be happy to address them. Some of the key takeaways we wanted you to really kind of walk away from this program with in terms of how to approach these challenges. Design first mindset, as we mentioned several times. Try to get embedded as early as you can in the design process. So try to work with your development teams, work with your product teams, work with your marketing teams, and try to take account for these new obligations as early as you can in the process. Principles-based approach. A lot of these basic privacy principles have been around for some time. Lean on them to be able to accomplish these obligations. Cross-functional collaboration. Can't say how important it is to maintain strong relationships with points of contact within the important departments of legal, IT, marketing, product design. So find those people, build relationships with those people, help them understand how important these privacy obligations are. And then through these efforts and by accomplishing these obligations, as Luke mentioned a couple of times, especially with companies that have a lot of B2C presence, you're building brand trust, and that's going to naturally increase engagement and just be overall very good for the business. So clear communication through your privacy notices, that you are adhering to these principles, that you're asking for consent where it's required, that you're minimizing the collection of data, that you're being respectful with your stewardship of the data once it's within your organization, with regards to further use of selling and sharing or use with third parties, are ways to build trust while maintaining compliance and reducing risk. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the final slide here. We've provided some contact information if you'd like to get a hold of any of us. Luke or myself here at Minor Partners, or Harry over at OneTrust. We've got some email addresses available there. And with that, I will go ahead and say, not seeing any questions coming in here, that'll give everybody a couple of minutes back of the hour, and thank all of you for taking some time to listen to this. I hope you gained some valuable insights you can take back and put into practice at your office. And Harry and Luke, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. It's much appreciated.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
All right. With that, I'll take us to a program close. Thanks, everybody.